In a small, quiet town, there lived a family called the Lees. Their home was tiny and old, always cold in winter and hot in summer. Even though they were very poor, the Lees were known for their kindness and hard work. Mr. Lee worked long hours in a factory, and Mrs. Lee cleaned houses for rich people in town. Their children, Sarah and Tom, dreamed of a better life. Even with both parents working, there was never enough money. Sarah was 10 years old, and Tom was 8. They went to the local school. They didn't have nice clothes like the other kids. Sometimes they didn't have enough food for lunch. But Sarah and Tom were good students. They worked hard in school because they wanted to help their family. Every night, the Lee family would sit together for dinner. They didn't have much food, but they always shared what they had. After dinner, Mr. and Mrs. Lee would talk about their dreams. They wanted a better life for their children. They wanted Sarah and Tom to go to college one day. One day, Mr. Lee lost his job at the factory. The factory closed down. Many people in town lost their jobs. Mr. Lee was very worried. He looked for a new job every day but couldn't find one. Mrs. Lee started working more hours. She was very tired, but she knew she had to work hard for her family. Sarah and Tom tried to help too. After school, they would collect bottles and cans to sell for a little money. Times were very hard for the Lee family. Sometimes they didn't have enough money for food. Their neighbors would bring them some bread or vegetables. The Lees were thankful for this help. Mr. Lee didn't give up. He kept looking for jobs. He also started learning new skills. Every day, he would go to the library. He read books about computers and business. He wanted to learn as much as he could. One day, Mr. Lee saw a sign in town. It said, "Computer repair shop needs help." Mr. Lee was excited. He had been learning about computers at the library. He went to the shop and talked to the owner. The owner liked Mr. Lee. He could see that Mr. Lee was smart and wanted to learn. He gave Mr. Lee a job. The pay wasn't much, but it was a start. Mr. Lee was very happy. At his new job, Mr. Lee worked very hard. He learned more about fixing computers. He was good at it. Customers liked him because he was kind and helpful. Soon, the shop owner gave Mr. Lee more hours and more pay. While Mr. Lee was working at the computer shop, Mrs. Lee had an idea. She was a very good cook. Her family and neighbors loved her food. Mrs. Lee thought maybe she could sell her food to make extra money. Mrs. Lee started making lunches for workers in town. She would wake up very early to cook. Then she would go to offices and factories to sell her lunches. People loved her food. Soon, many workers were buying lunch from Mrs. Lee every day. Sarah and Tom were proud of their parents. They saw how hard their mom and dad worked. They wanted to help too. Sarah started tutoring younger kids after school. Tom helped an old neighbor with her garden. They gave the money they earned to their parents. Slowly, things started to get better for the Lee family. They had more money for food. They could buy new clothes. They even saved a little money each month. The Lees were still poor, but they weren't as poor as before. Mr. Lee kept learning about computers. He became very good at fixing them. One day, he had an idea. He wanted to start his own computer repair business. It was a big dream, and it scared him a little. But Mrs. Lee encouraged him. She believed in him. Mr. Lee talked to the owner of the computer shop. The owner was sad to see Mr. Lee go, but he understood. He even helped Mr. Lee get started. He gave Mr. Lee some old computer parts and tools. Mr. Lee started his business in their small house. He fixed computers in their living room. At first, only a few people came, but Mr. Lee did a good job and word spread. More and more people started bringing their computers to Mr. Lee. Mrs. Lee's food business was doing well too. She was now selling lunches to many offices in town. She hired 2 helpers to cook with her. Mrs. Lee's food was becoming famous in their town. Sarah and Tom were doing well in school. Their teachers said they were very smart. Sarah won a math contest at school. Tom wrote a story that was published in the school newspaper. Mr. and Mrs. Lee were very proud of their children. As their businesses grew, the Lees needed more space. They saved money and bought a small building in town. The first floor became Mr. Lee's computer shop. The second floor had a kitchen for Mrs. Lee's food business. The Lees were very excited about their new place. With their new building, both businesses grew even more. Mr. Lee hired 2 people to help him fix computers. Mrs. Lee's food business became a small restaurant. People could now come and eat her delicious food. The Lee family was no longer poor. They had enough money for good food and nice clothes. They could even go on small vacations sometimes. But they didn't forget the hard times. They were thankful for everything they had. Mr. and Mrs. Lee wanted to help others who were poor. They remembered how hard it was. They started giving free computer classes at their shop. They also gave free meals to poor families at their restaurant. Sarah and Tom were now teenagers. They were excellent students. They both wanted to go to college. Mr. and Mrs. Lee were happy. They had enough money saved to send their children to college. Sarah decided to study business in college. She wanted to help run her parents' businesses one day. Tom wanted to become a teacher. He remembered how much he liked helping younger kids when he was little. The Lee family's hard work had paid off. They went from being very poor to having successful businesses. But they didn't become greedy or selfish. They stayed kind and helpful to others. Years passed. Sarah finished college and came back to help run the family businesses. She had new ideas to make the businesses even better. Tom became a teacher at the local school. He was a favorite among his students. Mr. and Mrs. Lee were very proud of their children. They were happy to see Sarah and Tom become successful. But they were even happier to see that their children were kind and helpful, just like them. The Lee's businesses kept growing. They opened a bigger restaurant in town. They also opened a computer store that sold new computers. Many people in town worked for the Lees now. Even though they were now rich, the Lees never forgot where they came from. They always helped poor families in town. They gave jobs to people who needed them. They donated money to the local school and hospital. One day, the mayor of the town came to visit the Lees. He wanted to give them an award. The award was for being the best business owners in town. The mayor said the Lees had helped make the town a better place. At the awards ceremony, Mr. Lee gave a speech. He talked about the hard times his family had faced. He talked about how they never gave up. He said that hard work and kindness were the keys to their success. Mrs. Lee also spoke. She thanked all the people who had helped them when they were poor. She said that the Lees would always try to help others, just as they had been helped. Sarah and Tom were very proud of their parents. They knew how hard their mom and dad had worked. They promised to always remember their family's journey and to keep helping others. The Lee family story became famous in their town. It inspired other poor families to work hard and never give up. The Lees showed that with hard work, kindness, and help from others, it was possible to overcome poverty. Years later, Mr. and Mrs. Lee retired. They left their businesses to Sarah. Tom continued teaching at the school. The Lee family was known not just for their success, but for their kindness and generosity. The little town had changed a lot since the Lees were poor. It was now a better place, with more jobs and opportunities. The Lee family had played a big part in making that happen. Mr. and Mrs. Lee often thought about their journey. They remembered the tiny, cold house they used to live in. They remembered the times when they didn't have enough food. But they also remembered the kindness of their neighbors, the excitement of starting their businesses, and the joy of watching their children grow up. They were thankful for everything they had. But most of all, they were thankful that they could now help others. They had turned their own struggles into a way to make life better for many people. The Lee family's story shows us that hard times don't last forever. It shows us that with hard work, learning, and kindness, we can change our lives. And it shows us that when we become successful, we should always remember to help others.